Hello, CMXers. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. Before I start, I have to say I am a prosciutto and goat cheese guy on my pizza all the way. So um, do with that information as you will. I am so excited to have the opportunity to speak here at the CMX Summit and cannot wait to see all of your thoughts and discussions in the chat. Today, I'll share my experience as a community content creator and how I've built and maintained engagement in several mature community spaces through proactive discussion starters, content rituals, tutorials, and more, as well as how you can put these practices to work for your own communities right away. Before we dive on in, I'd like to share a little bit about myself. My name is Drew Bonillas, and I'm one of the customer community managers over at BigCommerce, where I largely focus on building engagement in our various community spaces and facilitating the conversations that come about from them. I and the rest of my teammates reside in Austin, Texas, where BigCommerce is headquartered. Some fun facts about me are, though I live in Texas now, I was actually born in Anchorage. I was a bartender before starting my tech journey, and I also love to sing karaoke, though I will never claim to be any good at it. Today, we'll start by talking about the challenges that many of us face as community managers. I'll then speak about the differences between different community spaces and how you can tailor your content to reflect those differences. Next, I'll talk about just some of the many examples of proactive content that you can implement in your communities right away, along with examples from the BigCommerce community spaces that I help manage. I'll then address the age-old question that I'm sure we all think of regularly, and that is, what are some possible ways that you can measure your success so you can confidently communicate them? Finally, I'll give some final food for thought, and we will move over to the Q&A portion of the presentation, where I will try to answer all of your questions, and hopefully we get some fun conversations happening in the chat as well. Now, before I begin, I just want to recognize that no two communities are exactly alike, and you won't really know what your community needs or what kind of problems your community might face until you take some time listening to your members. The BigCommerce community that I help manage is a product support community. So our members come to our various community spaces because they're customers or users of our platform and are looking to connect with their peers. Your community may be different in its purpose, but a lot of the advice I'm sharing today can still help. All that said, I'm going to talk over some common obstacles that I've encountered growing our community. So let's start by talking about lurkers. Now, it's a common misconception to think that the main goal in community building is to convert lurkers. But it's also important to consider that having lurkers are a sign of success. Lurkers are, at the very least, a sign that the content you and your other members share is worth, well, lurking over. That said, you might want to have less people in your community simply looking at content and would rather have more active participants working to make connections with other community members. Next, we have spam. We see it all the time, and it's an inescapable consequence of just the internet existing. Without meaningful content in your community spaces, it's even easier for spam posts to flourish. I've noticed that when you're successful in growing consistent, positive engagement, your community all-stars are quick to report spam for you and keep their community healthy. Spam can come in all sorts of forms, so be sure you have your community group rules clear and stick by them. Finally, and maybe most relevant to this presentation, your community might simply not have any activity in it. We're dealing with a lot right now. I, for one, know that I haven't been quite as active in my mushroom identification Facebook group lately, but really, who can blame me? There's always going to be periods of downtime and low activity. And that is why I want to talk about nudging your members in the right direction by posting proactive content that they want to engage with. Moving on, it's important to note that just like no two communities are the same, no two community spaces are the same either. A big part of community building is meeting your members where they are and catering your content to the members in those spaces. Now, I'm going to go over just a few different types of community spaces very briefly and some characteristics that I've observed from them in the BigCommerce community. So let's start off strong and talk about Facebook. The great thing about Facebook is that due to how long it's been around and the popularity of it, there is a very good chance that a lot of your users are already on Facebook. From my experience, Facebook users tend to be a bit less of a technical audience and are much more open to lighthearted and fun content, which I will show you an example of later on in the presentation. In the BigCommerce Facebook group, we have a bigger emphasis on building relationships since it's a private group. So we encourage our members and staff to be a bit less guarded and professional here. This is the kind of space where I feel like I can communicate as I would normally. Another example I have here is Reddit. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, Reddit is one of the nicest and most considerate community spaces. I'm kidding. But Reddit is certainly a different animal than Facebook, and your content should really reflect that. While Reddit may seem a bit more daunting or maybe even hostile, I like to look at it as more of a difference of culture. Anecdotally, I found that Reddit users respond better to straightforward content that offers practical value, as opposed to fluffy conversation starters. So, for example, I think it would be entirely possible to be met with a barrage of downvotes if I were to check in and ask what everyone's favorite breed of dog is, whereas a tutorial or a pro tip might get some better conversation started. It's also important to consider Reddit. Reddit comes with its own unspoken rules for how people like to communicate and consume content. And it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with those anytime you're jumping into a fully formed ecosystem. That can apply to touchy-feely conversation starters, like I already mentioned, emoji use in posts and titles, use of embedded images in posts, and more. The last space I'm going to touch on are your hosted brand communities. At BigCommerce, this is our Help Center community. This is a space where it's really important to listen to what your community members are asking for. It's very likely that people with a diverse array of interests are going to be all together in this hub. In our case, we have our customers at various stages of experience on the platform, tech and agency partners, and even other BigCommerce employees. So we have to experiment with what works, try some different content out, and see what works and what flops, but you'll never know until you try. So just to show you that it happens to all of us, here is one of my very first pieces of proactive content that I shared in the BigCommerce Help Center community. I coincidentally asked our members to share a mistake that they've made and what they learned from it so that others don't have to make the same mistake. And as you can imagine, this might have been a tall order for our members to talk about mistakes in their livelihood to a perfect stranger. So my lesson learned. Now, how about I stop prefacing and actually talk about some different types of proactive content? There are all kinds of content you can put into your communities to get your members interested, but I'm going to go through just a few examples and a few of the different BigCommerce community spaces to give you some inspiration. And don't worry, I will include about what community spaces I think these would be best in. Starting off with my personal favorite, we have rituals. Rituals at their core are typically low lift, themed posts that you put out with some disciplined regularity. I usually like to keep my rituals to once a week and on the same day so that people can know when to expect them. I love rituals because I think over time they really start to belong to your members and become something that they look forward to. The very first ritual that I started over at BigCommerce was our GIF Wednesday ritual, where I just ask some sort of question that I think our members would be interested in and challenge them to answer it using only a GIF. In this example, I had just started my community building journey, and I was interested in getting to know our Facebook group members a bit more, as well as let them know something about me without presenting them some boring bio of myself. And as you can see, we got some fun discussion started. Over time, I can imagine a world where I hand this ritual over to an engaged community member to take over themselves. And this is a great way to work towards a more member led community. Keep in mind, though, this is not the type of ritual that I imagine being very successful in our subreddit. And you don't have to have your ritual span across all your community spaces. The next type of content I want to talk about are polls. Polls are this sort of amazing secret weapon because they, for the most part, don't require a lot of effort for anyone involved. Your community members can also get applicable value from polls as they very well may be wanting to know what everyone else is doing. Polls also offer another benefit, since you can use the data collected in the results to create other content. For example, if you have a poll about whether or not your users use a specific app and the majority of respondents say they do, that can be a great indicator that discussion starters or pro tips about getting the most out of the app will do well as future proactive content. Whether you're going to use the data from these polls or not, if you're wanting future members to see value and engage in a growing space, it helps to have content that is engaged with by the click of a button. The two examples that you see here are, if you haven't guessed already, from our Reddit community. You might notice that there's not an emoji in sight, and my text is clear and to the point to minimize the effort required on the part of the voter. Next up, we have tutorials. Now, these might not be applicable one-to-one for all communities, especially if you don't manage a support community, but I think there are some takeaways that can be valuable to everyone. The examples I have here are from BigCommerce's Slay the Holidays campaign from last year, where I created a whole series of video tutorials to walk our community members through key aspects of our platform that they can utilize to drive sales during the busy holiday selling season. Now, tutorials don't necessarily need to be in a video format like this, but one of my goals for last year was to really become more than just a name on a screen for our members. A video format also isn't a bad way to connect with your more visual learners out there. While tutorials can be a bit more work than a simple poll, I still find myself sharing these tutorials with folks who have these same questions, and the gratitude really does make it all worth it. Moving right along, we have discussion starters. Now, discussion starters are a bit bigger of an ask for members, as the goal is to get your community members to share thoughtful responses to the prompt. So you can have to be prepared for the very real possibility that a certain prompt may tank, and that's perfectly okay. It can take time for a community to get mature enough for members to feel comfortable putting themselves out there and discussing what they think. This is where you can pull in your community all-stars for help. If you have a rapport with a community member, don't be scared to ask for help. Something like, hey, we just posted a discussion starter in the group, and I know that other members really value your input. Do you mind helping us get the conversation started? This makes all the difference, and it honestly makes that member an even stronger advocate for your community. Last but not least, I'd like to talk a bit about events, because who among us doesn't love a good event? There's lots of different kinds of events like AMAs, hackathons, happy hours, and conferences, and many more. But I'm going to talk about the biggest and most successful event that we put on at BigCommerce, and that is the BigCommerce Town Hall. The BigCommerce Town Hall is a monthly webinar where our community members get to hear important platform and industry updates from our CEO and product team. After the presentation, we do a Q&A where our community members get to have their voices heard and their questions answered. Giving your community members that time to be together, asking the questions they want answered, is an invaluable part of community building. Members can leave the event with exciting updates to discuss back in their respective community spaces, and are a great way to encourage organic conversations unprompted by a community manager. Events are obviously a bigger lift for your internal teams, and do require a time commitment from your community members. So it's best to not go overboard with too many events at once. Hold them as one-off activities or find a cadence that works for your team and your community to not overwhelm yourself and your members. Now, you might be asking yourself, Drew, my guy, how do I know if all of these engagement opportunities and proactive content is working? Well, that depends on what your goals for your community spaces are. It could be more members, it could be more posts and comments, higher question resolution rate, or something else. Also, keep in mind that your goals can look totally different depending on what community space you're looking at. You could want to focus on growing your Facebook group members, but also just wanting someone to talk to another person in Reddit. Just take some time to decide what's important to you and your community and curate your content types to achieve those goals. I will show you an example though of how I did it. A big goal of mine last year was to grow our Reddit community, and I'll show you what was important to me in measuring my success. So in Q2, we recorded that we had a 5% increase in subscribers, which isn't bad, but also wasn't super important to me. I was much more interested in getting more people talking to each other and viewing the resources and content that I'd begun sharing, adding to the channel. And as you can see, we saw a steep increase in engagement, which in itself is very validating. This type of growth is probably abnormal. We made a conscious decision to improve the subreddit's culture and consequently went from doing very little to giving it as much attention to all of our other spaces. But the difference here speaks for itself. Further, the difference in attitude and culture is less quantifiable, but it creates a feedback loop that has better content feeding into more content, which continues to improve both the quality and quantity of engagement. Now, do I think that I'm going to be able to sustain this level of growth? Probably not, but these numbers do at the very least tell me the work I'm doing is making a difference and it's worth continuing for now. Now, just some final thoughts before Q&A. I know I talked about a lot of different opportunities to start building engagement in your community spaces, and it might be easy to want to do all of them right now, but community building is about the long game. You don't want to go in guns blazing, spamming your members with all this new content all at once. So my final parting advice is to start slow, pick something that you think might be interesting in your community, and get started. Okay, that was a lot of information we went over, but I think we have plenty of time for some questions.
Oh, there you go. Absolutely. Yeah, let's see if we have any questions in the chat. Reminder, you can throw any questions you have for Drew into the chat here. We do have one here, Drew.
Alrighty.
How do you promote community events like town hall to make sure your community members are aware that they're happening?
Good question. Events, like I mentioned, is a cross teams effort. So, teaming up with marketing to make sure town hall information is going out, your email teams. Probably in the early stages of an event like that, it'll be a lot of hard promotion on your existing spaces where things are most popular. If you have any buy-in from, say, if your company has a blog, maybe this is a great opportunity to start promoting that event there. I mean, this event, for example, is all over Twitter, and for a private community event, it might not be as applicable, but depending on the event, you could want new members to join who might not necessarily be a part of the community. So just full force.
Absolutely. All right, we have another question here for you, Drew. Can you think of a specific type of content that you might have tried in one space, but when you tried to put it into a new space, it didn't have the same results or it didn't succeed?
Yeah, so when I was first starting, I was very doe-eyed and gun-ho, if you can imagine. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to check in and see what what people think about pumpkin spice lattes, which I think fitting. It was around this time last year, and people hated it in our help center community. Not interested at all. But like I mentioned before, like Facebook, you can probably get away with that kind of thing. But people are typically going to our support community forums for an answer to a question. And I don't think typically like seeing fluffy, fun conversation starters there. So definitely it's a matter of know your audience. And, I still encourage everyone to ask what people's thoughts are on pumpkin spice in their branded communities because, you never really know. People might love it, people might hate it. Um,
There's
I
strong
think we
opinions.
all go into this fairly blind.
Absolutely. Strong opinions on pumpkin spice. That's for sure.
Yeah, I thought so.
Great. We had a question that's talking about how do you respond to inappropriate gifts? Maybe it's like in a larger question of like, how do you moderate some of those different channels when you're on Facebook, Reddit, your own internal channel? If you find some inappropriate content, what's kind of like your go-to strategy that way?
Well, I think could be sort of like one-on-one with like solicitation of services. I think that could be,
Sure.
an example of something that's a no-no in all of our community spaces. Um, I think having just honest and open communication with the offenders, it doesn't always have to be post remove blocked every time. It can be, we want to see how we can help you promote, or help other community members in the best possible way. And it probably doesn't look like spamming everyone's posts with their product. So, having that conversation of, this is the rules, this is why they're that way. Let's work on a way that we can make this more appropriate. Maybe we can work together to do a demo of the product and share. Maybe we can promote a webinar where you talk about it and we have a group community discussion on, the value that this brings to all of us.
Absolutely. The next question we have is from John. He had a general question in terms of like what social networks do you focus on, but maybe for some of the community managers who aren't on certain social networks, like what is there a certain one that you suggest starting with and then kind of getting involved in first before branching out to others, or like any advice that way?
Yeah. I think there are definitely some tougher channels out there to get engagement, Reddit being one of them. I think if you're asking for a pretty straightforward answer, I think Facebook is oftentimes a very easy way to go. People are typically pretty friendly there. The culture is very bubbly. Most people are on Facebook, and it depends on also what kind of community you run. I mean, if you run like a creative art sort of community, TikTok might be a great place for you to engage with your members. But if you have a knitting community or something, Facebook sounds like spot on.
Yeah, I love that. Question from Karen. So how much runway do you give yourself when you're trying new things? You were pretty vulnerable and you shared like some posts that didn't work, things like that. But do you run it for a quarter or less? And how do you kind of run your experimentation a little bit when you're doing new stuff?
I'm pretty stubborn, I'll be honest. I shared things on the same vein a few times. I like to keep track of, some engagement markers on those posts and sort of lump them in their own section, their own category. So, on Facebook, for example, you can look at total views and likes and comments. And if you can compile those numbers with, say, a more successful post, the difference becomes pretty stark. So once again, straightforward answer, until you are tired of being sad that nobody wants to talk to you about that thing. I think give yourself as much grace as you'd like. But as soon as your heart tells you that this is not going to work and I can't force my community to be what I want it to be.
True. Yeah, absolutely. This is a good question. So a lot of times when we're creating proactive content, sometimes we are confronted with like a lull in engagement, right? What do you do in those scenarios when there's like a lull in engagement, or how do you try to like reignite the spark within the channel?
Definitely consistency in your posts and your rituals. I also think bringing in, this is that time to bring in your community all-stars. Try to get a rapport with one person. There's no shame in asking for help. And especially if it's someone, well-liked or well-known in your community. I can think of a few that get a lot of praise. And bring them in. Just ask them to sort of stir up some drama, because not everyone likes to chat with, a brand, representative. It sometimes can feel less authentic.
Yes, 100%. Great point. Sarah is asking, do you have any LinkedIn specific tips? They're looking at starting a community on LinkedIn with like a closed group style. I'm not sure if you guys do the same thing at Big Commerce or if you have any tips that way.
We do not. I do a lot of moderation on LinkedIn, but we do not actually have a closed LinkedIn community. It just didn't seem like something that is a place where our members gather as particularly. Now, is that something I would not consider? I mean, it's definitely something to look into. I think going back to the heart of it is trying some stuff out and see what flops and what works. I know LinkedIn is definitely a more professional atmosphere, but people will always have that in common, and I think that's why it's such a great platform. Is because everyone that's there is a professional, and they all have that in common, which is community 101, a common interest. So yeah.
Absolutely. All right, we have a special question from the president of your self-proclaimed president of your fan club, Lauren. She asks, how do you organize and plan engagement and content ideas across so many channels?
I use a content calendar. The software, if you want it, I'm not sponsored, but I use Airtable. And if anyone's interested, I wrote a blog article on how you can manage content using a marketing calendar, and it tracks fairly well from a business owner marketing calendar to a community manager. So if you'd like to see that link, I mean, I'm more than welcome to share. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I can send you that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We have a question from Erica around, do you have any like best practices on ideal times or days to post within your community, or any like metrics you're paying attention to for engagement?
So most social softwares like Reddit and Facebook will both tell you sort of high activity periods when members of your group are online and commenting. So definitely use the data that you get, because in socials, we often can be frustrated by the lack of analytics data that we see, but that is one. So I'd say, once again, try some content out, and then you can sort of see, what times work best also, and using the built-in analytics tools that most platforms do. And for your branded communities, I mean, Google Analytics is also, king when it comes to that. Mm-hmm. So we don't always get a lot of data, but use the data that you can.
Absolutely.
The little that we get.
Yeah. You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but Pixie had a good question. Is there a way or a strategy that you're using to kind of build the habit for your members to post content on their own, so it's not just coming from you? Or how do you kind of bridge that?
That's a great question. In our community, I can't say we have that problem, just because, like I said, it is a support community, and people are posting because likely they need answers to something. I mean, one thing, I'm a huge swag fan, so if you notice new upcoming members, that can, if it's in your budget or in your means, those are the kind of people that you want to value, thank for their work, That's another big thing of mine. Just always comment, just my little face saying thank you everywhere in our groups. I think people really just crave that validation that, they're not paid to do this, they're not paid to help, but, I could not do it without our members. So just a quick thank you through and through for helping out. I think that's validating. It gets people, coming back and being bigger ambassadors for your brand, for your community.
For sure. Are there ways that you're looking, or are there people maybe that you follow, or like ways that you're looking to like generate new ideas for some of the content when you get stuck?
I am on a lot of different communities, just viciously stealing content. Maybe not stealing, but I really love Atlassian's community. I just listened to a talk earlier from them. Yeah, just going through other people's communities. I look up to lots of community spaces. And like I said, lots of content can sort of feed off of itself. Like I mentioned in polls, one poll I can get, maybe 3 proactive discussion starters out of that. And also, people will ask questions and conversations, I think, naturally gravitate towards certain topics and groups occasionally. So if you see a bunch of people asking about a certain topic, it might be time to bring an official post from you on that.
Absolutely. Looks like a couple of folks have posted that blog article in the chat, which is great. Your fan club doing the work for you,
Love them.
It sounds like we have a couple other people who want to be part of the fan club. So I think reach out to Lauren on how to do that. But really appreciate your presentation, Drew. I think we all got a lot of information from it and some really good actionable insights. If people want to connect with you or ask, questions post this summit, what's like the best way to get in touch?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably going to be the best way. It's just Drew Bonillas. And I'd love to connect with literally all of you. It sounds amazing. Let's chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. Really appreciate it.